All right, hello everybody. I am John Halderson. I'm the chair of DEEP, and welcome to our presentation tonight. So it's a bit of a hybrid. We have some people in attendance at the community center, and then the rest of you are taking this in by Zoom. So I'd like to thank you for your time, for being here, and I will introduce Professor John Clague from SFU. And I'll turn it over to you, John. And
Thank you, John, and welcome to everyone on a really blustery night as we approach the anniversary of the big atmospheric river event, which is in about 2 weeks, I think, mid-November, which will come back in a lot of details on the media, I'm sure, very quickly. Yeah, well, I'm not going to talk about the atmospheric river event. I'm going to talk about another hazard that is often in the news, and that's tsunamis. And I kind of refer to them as stealth killers because they often reach the shoreline rather innocently looking. You know, a lot of people actually go down to the shore to look at these the approaching waves, which superficially, at least at first, can resemble storm-driven waves, but they're very, very different, as I'll point out in a second. So I'm going to walk you through this. Maybe it's down. Okay, so let's start out with a kind of a definition of tsunami. It's a term that has a Japanese derivation, and the Japanese refer to them as harbor waves. Harbor is kind of recognition of the fact that they often cause the maximum damage in embayments like harbors. And over hundreds and hundreds of years, the Japanese have experienced these. Other countries have as well, but the Japanese seem to receive them more often than most countries, and I'll explain why that is in a moment. So tsunami really in Japanese refers to harbor wave. Formerly, kind of in North America, they were referred to as tidal waves, which is really a bad term because they're not tidal at all. I'm not quite sure where that came from, but at the very least, they're not tidal. And they're often produced by earthquakes. I'm going to walk you through different kind of ways that tsunamis can form. But a really common one is by an earthquake. And this sort of shows what happens when a big earthquake occurs beneath the seafloor, and sometimes lakes even, and displaces the seafloor or the floor of the lake upward or downward. It can be either way. And it does this over a very large area if you're talking about a large earthquake. And when that happens, it basically displaces the water column above it, either up or down. And that propagates a waveform through the entire water column. And this is where it really differs from, say, a storm wave, a wind-driven wave, because wind-driven waves only affect the very thinnest portion of the ocean. These are often called body waves because they affect the entire water column. And they're very energy preservational, meaning, you know, they can travel very long distances and lose very little energy. And we experienced that back in, I think it was 2003, the Boxing Day tsunami in the Indian Ocean, where this massive tsunami reached as far as the east coast of Africa and claimed fatalities in Africa, you know, which is about 7,000 kilometers away. And that's kind of what I mean by stealth. I mean, they're produced in one place, but they can travel halfway around the world. And even in a very diminished form, in that particular case, that was such a big tsunami, we're picking up sort of evidence of that at tidal stations all around the world. It was just totally remarkable. And so they're propagated in that wave, and they affect the entire water column. And typically they travel a lot faster in deep water than in shallow water. And you'll see that in some of the examples I provide where, over short distances in shallow water, it takes a long time for the tsunami to reach the shoreline. Whereas in the open ocean, they can travel as fast as a jet plane, 800 kilometers an hour. And in the open ocean, if you were in a rowboat, you probably wouldn't even be aware that that waveform is passing beneath you because they're low waves and long wavelength waves. So they can have the separation between the crest of two adjacent waves can be tens of kilometers, 100 kilometers or more. And in deep water, they probably would have a height of less than a meter. So you wouldn't even kind of be aware of it. It's only when they reach the shore that kind of all that energy gets packed into a diminished water space. And they slow down as they approach the shore, slow down tremendously, and they gain height. And then commonly, they don't break, they rather become turbulent. The water mass actually becomes highly turbulent. The energy is kind of contained within that turbulent water mass, and they run ashore. And they have so much energy that they can run long distances upshore. The record is about 45 meters in elevation in Japan after the Tohoku earthquake. In one embayment, water reached 45 meters above sea level. So you might say you're safe at 45 meters, but it turned out, no, you weren't. That's a record. Normally they don't do quite that, but in the case of the Indian Ocean tsunami, they did run long distances inland because in many places around the Indian Ocean, you have these flat coastal plains that are very low. They don't rise much above sea level. And these turbulent water masses can race ashore for kilometers, long distances. So I'm going to talk about, really, I'm going to focus, well, not focus, but I'm just going to try to explain that there are different natural processes that can produce tsunamis. We normally just think of them as earthquake triggered. Commonly, that's the most common cause. And in fact, the two worst tsunami disasters in the past, let's see, it'd be about 30 years now, were earthquake triggered. The one in Indonesia in 2003 and the one in Japan about a decade later. And together they claimed 250,000 lives. So, aside from the Haiti earthquake, the Port-au-Prince Haiti earthquake, these are the worst, most killing phenomena that we experience. You could probably say that we really haven't been fully tested during an earthquake in a major megacity where you might experience those losses of life and injury. But these are really kind of understated, in terms of the toll they've taken. So let's start out with earthquakes, because I kind of started it that way. And of course, as you know, earthquakes aren't just randomly distributed on the planet. Most earthquakes, I would say 95 to 99% of earthquakes occur very close to or along what we call plate boundaries. So the Earth's outer shell is broken into a number of very, very large plates, of which we live on one called the North America plate. And there are a bunch of others, some are large, some are small. And it's where those plates collide with one another is where you build up stress, or you build up elastic strain, and you release it in earthquakes. And all an earthquake is a place where two blocks of the Earth's crust slip, and that releases another wave form of energy. It's not waves that pass through water. It's waves that use water as a medium. It's waves that use the Earth's crust as a medium, or the Earth's mantle. And so we, of course, live right there. We just happen to live at a plate boundary. And that's why we get earthquakes, is we're right at a plate boundary. And that is not a boundary between two of the largest plates. It's a boundary between one of the largest plates, but another very small one. And the offshore one is called the Juan de Fuca plate. And it is colliding with North America in what's called a subduction zone, a subduction process, meaning that the two plates are converging against one another, and typically the denser, in this case, oceanic plate slips down beneath the crust of North America. And that's occurring right off our coast. I wouldn't exactly call the Juan de Fuca plate a small plate. It's actually more than 1,000 kilometers long. It extends from the Pacific off central Vancouver Island down to Northern California. And it is basically moving down beneath North America. And we know now that that's not a very nice situation in terms of what ultimately will happen. Because here we have the Juan de Fuca plate in its cartoon diagram moving down beneath North America, the continental crust above it. And originally, about 40 years ago, scientists thought that the two plates were sliding frictionlessly past one another. And then there was a big debate in the scientific community that Canadian geophysicists contributed to that showed, they're hung up. They're basically locked against one another. And they're locked against one another at depth along a dipping plane that basically is quite large. It's tens of kilometers wide, and it's over 1,000 kilometers long. And we know that is happening, that the two plates are locked, because we can actually infer that from the deformation that's occurring at the Earth's surface. So now we have, and have had for 26 or 27 years, this miraculous, I call it miraculous, hard to understand, satellite capability of measuring a point on the Earth's surface to within a millimeter. If it's a fixed, well-fixed point, you know, and not subject to the vagaries of weather or anything like that, 1 or 2 millimeters. And what scientists have done, have used that satellite-based technology to show that over the last 26 or 27 years, that Vancouver Island is going up slowly, very slowly, millimeters per year, and Victoria is getting closer to Vancouver at a rate of millimeters per year. Now, when you think about that, this type of pattern, compression, uplift, and shortening, you can reasonably infer that that's due to the fact that something's hung up beneath your feet, in the crust. And that's the fundamental basis on which this locked interface between those two plates has been mapped out. There still is ongoing work on that. You know, there's a lot of new science that's coming out on refining that zone. But the notion is that over time, even at those very minuscule low rates, you accumulate a lot of elastic strain. You know, you're basically, think of it as a spring. You're compressing the bloody spring, and eventually something slips. And the two plates that were locked slide relative to one another. In the case of the Tohoku earthquake, which is a very similar setting to what we have off our coast, those two plates slipped up to about 30 or 40 meters in an instant. Well, not an instant, it actually took 90 seconds, but you know, Japan suddenly got a little closer to us, you know, in an instant. And of course, that releases a lot of energy. Typically, these are magnitude 8 or 9 earthquakes. The Tohoku earthquake was about the 3rd or 4th largest that we've ever had. It was about a 9.2 or 9.3. But it also results in this rebound effect. You know, basically, if this were to happen here, North America would extend itself, would ramp up along that dipping plane by about maybe 10, 20, 30 meters. And the melting seafloor behind it would be impacted. It would actually change its shape, really a lot, you know, kind of locally go down way more than the height of this room. And that sets in motion tsunamis. So my whole point is that those type of earthquakes, and that's not the only type of earthquakes that happen, but those type of earthquakes, subduction zone earthquakes, are the ones that commonly produce big tsunamis. Now, occasionally you can get other types of earthquakes that do it too, but the really big tsunamis that we've had throughout Earth's history are a result of this subduction zone process. So just going to touch on the mother of all those because I remember it very well. It was shocking to me. This is a subduction zone very much like ours, but it separates two very large plates. It separates what's called the Eurasia plate to the east from the Australia plate to the west. And it was accumulating strain just like our subduction zone is accumulating strain. And on December 26, 2004, at one point along that interface, it broke. And then the plate slipped, another like a zipper opening up for over, I think about 1,000 kilometers to the north. So that's why it takes 60 seconds or 90 seconds, because the initial rupture has to propagate along the entire subduction zone. And of course, that set in motion this crazy tsunami that killed 250,000 people. And this is the subduction zone is right there. And this is a kind of a model of how that tsunami propagated westward and eastward. And because the break was oriented north-south, that the main effects were felt in an east-west direction. And you can see here it's reaching Sri Lanka. These are times of arrival. So the earthquake happened, and 2 hours later, Sri Lanka was experiencing the tsunami. And I forget the exact numbers, but I think about 20,000 people were killed in Sri Lanka 2 hours after the earthquake, and they really didn't feel the earthquake. You know, it just appeared. And in shallower water, it traveled much more slowly. So you can see here the waves and the travel isobars are compacted. It was 3 hours after the earthquake that Thailand was hit hard. So even though Sri Lanka is much farther away from the source of the earthquake, the waves arrived in Sri Lanka earlier than they arrived in Thailand, or just a little earlier. And then it continued on. The Maldives are right here. So after 3 hours, the Maldives were struck. And I think after about 7 or 8 hours, it reached Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. And this, to me, I mean, they had a lot of video of this, of course. And this is basically a still frame from a video that shows the tsunami arriving on Phi Island, which is off Thailand. And this is a resort area. And of course, it happened at a time when there were lots of people in the resort. And it was very, you know, the next few frames would have shown the damage that, you know, affected the buildings that you see here, which are all resort hotels. And you get a feeling for the nature of a tsunami. You know, it's no longer a waveform when it reaches the shoreline. It's more a turbulent, onrushing mass. Turbid water, commonly carrying a lot of sediment. If there's any debris in the water, it's using that as battering rams to injure people. You can anthropomorphize it. And that's kind of what a tsunami looks like. It's not like that introductory slide I had that shows a break wave. That's wind-driven type stuff. You know, that's not the same as a tsunami. And just to give you a sense for how powerful a tsunami can be, this is an area at the epicenter of the tsunami on Banda Aceh, Indonesia. This is a city that was just devastated by the tsunami. Everything here is below about, I don't know, 2 or 3 meters above sea level. And this is before, you know, a month or two, a satellite image a month or two before the tsunami. And this is what it looked like afterwards. Not a single building standing. And you can see that stuff was basically carried, big slabs of concrete were carried by the wave, the turbulent water masses inland, destroyed a bridge here. Everything here is underwater, partly because this was in the zone where the earthquake caused subsidence. So the land as well as the seafloor subsided, and this was inundated as well as hammered by the tsunami. So earthquakes are nasty critters, you know, in terms of producing this. Interestingly, we've had almost no loss of life on our earthquake-prone coast from tsunamis, where you'd expect to experience that. The largest loss of life in Canada from a tsunami is in Newfoundland. which kind of I find ironic in a way, but that's the way it was. And this was a tsunami in 1929 that struck the Burin Peninsula, which is kind of a finger of land that sticks out from Newfoundland into the Atlantic Ocean. And it killed 27 people in Newfoundland, and I think a few people in Nova Scotia as well. And this was earthquake triggered, but it was more than earthquake triggered. And we've subsequently learned that many supposedly earthquake triggered tsunamis actually are in a way triggered by earthquakes, but the real tsunami is generated by a submarine landslide, which can also displace the seafloor. It can create the same waves that an earthquake would, although usually the landslides aren't big enough to produce a tsunami of the aerial extent and size of an earthquake triggered one. But anyway, in 1929, there was an earthquake on the Grand Banks off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, totally rogue earthquake. 7.2, you would never expect an earthquake like that. But it did occur, and it was felt as far west as Ottawa, caused damage in Halifax. These are intensities of shaking, and triggered a massive, massive failure on the seafloor, a big landslide that basically turned into what we call a turbidity current that ran down the continental slope and broke all the submarine cables or damaged the cables that were on the seafloor. And it was the landslide that actually produced the tsunami. You can see that this area, which is the source of the earthquake and the landslide, really is not too far away from Newfoundland. And here is Burin Peninsula right there, sticking out, right out into the path of the tsunami. And basically it's been modeled. The landslide triggered this waveform that propagated in deep water very fast. So after 120 minutes, it was more than 1,000 kilometers away from Newfoundland. But you can see also the same phenomena that we saw in the 2004 Indonesian tsunami. It traveled much more slowly back over the shallow waters of the continental shelf. And it was actually 2 hours before it reached Burin Peninsula right here. And nobody in Newfoundland had any conception of what was coming. They felt the earthquake, but they had no reason to think that there was a tsunami heading their way. But there was, and it caused a lot of damage to the outports on Burin Peninsula, particularly the outports that faced out onto the source of the landslide and the tsunami. And 27 people were killed in these outports. They basically had no reason to leave the shoreline. They felt the earthquake, but there was no understanding that that was kind of the setup for a tsunami. And actually the tsunami in this outport here at Lord's Cove reached up to 9 meters above sea level. And remember, these are fishing people. They live right on the shoreline. Almost, we saw that in the hurricane that just happened. They're right at the shoreline. That's where they want to be. So they had no advanced warning. It happened at night, and it just came, and a lot of people were injured and killed. So that's kind of a cascading effect of an earthquake and a landslide. And I wanted to show you one more, which is my favorite. And I've been here, Lituya Bay in Southeast Alaska, near Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve. In 1958, there was a magnitude 8 earthquake along a fault at the head of Lituya Bay. That happens to be a major active fault, like the San Andreas Fault. It's called the Fairweather Fault, but it's very similar in form to the San Andreas Fault, and then it produces big, great earthquakes, magnitude 8 earthquakes, in this case due to horizontal movement of the 2 blocks of the Earth's crust. And so that earthquake triggered a large rock slide at the head of the bay. And that displaced the water. It's questionable whether you'd call this a tsunami or a displacement wave. And you might think that's picking kind of hairs in terminology, but it's actually the result of a mass of earth material striking the surface of the inlet and displacing the water out from it. But it's very similar in its effect to a true tsunami, so we typically call them tsunamis. In this case, there was pristine old-growth forest right down to the shoreline, and the displaced water ran up the opposite slope from where the rock slide came into the inlet up to 1,600 feet above sea level, 585 meters. Not only did it reach that high, it stripped every living tree off that surface. So this is a bare rock slope, and amazingly, somebody saw it. They felt the earthquake. They were a husband and wife on a fishing boat, which fishing boats commonly use this as anchorage away from the open Pacific Ocean. So they go through this little inlet here and anchor overnight before going out to sea the next day. They picked the wrong day because they witnessed the rock slide, and they witnessed this huge wave coming down the inlet towards them. They were anchored, and there was nothing they could do. It only took a minute or two for the wave to reach the boat. There were two others that were never found. But in this case, the boat, the Badger, was lifted up by the wave and carried across the spit. And let me show you, the spit is right here. So the boat was carried over the spit. It took the anchor off the bottom. And the way this is a quote from the husband who operated the boat, Swanson. And he said, the stern first just below the crest of the wave like a surfboard. So you can imagine this fishing boat kind of riding a crest of a wave. I can imagine it myself. He looked down on the trees growing on the spit. And I don't know, I think he's exaggerating a bit, but he believes that he was about 2 boat lengths above the tops of the trees on the spit. And the wave crest broke just outside the spit, and the boat hit bottom, foundered from distance from the shore. Mr. and Mrs. Swanson abandoned their boat in a small skiff and were picked up by a trawler about 2 hours later. You know, if they were a cat, they used all 9 of their lives. It's a remarkable story. And that one is an example of a tsunami that we could experience, although not on that scale, but we have so many inlets along our coast, so many embayments, so many lakes. In fact, this can happen in a lake where you have a rock slide into a lake. And we have thousands of kilometers of shoreline, which are increasingly getting populated. You know, I think of Shuswap Lake, for example. There's some big, humongous, scary looking rock slopes above Salmon Arm. Not saying they're unstable, but I think eventually we're going to experience something like that on a smaller scale, but it could be quite deadly. Okay, so we have earthquakes, landslides. We recently saw that volcanic eruptions can produce tsunamis too. And I love Tongan names, you know. Hunga Tonga Hunga Haipai. It's a volcano that began to become active in mid-December and started to erupt. And it's a submarine volcano. It's largely below sea level. But it began to erupt. And then in early January, the activity subsided until January 14th. And then it just blew up. It basically blew up, created this plume of ash and water vapor, carbon dioxide, that reached altitudes that no eruption has ever reached before. They reached into outer space, you know, and by outer space, I mean above the stratosphere, I forget what it's called, the mesocline or something like that. And it produced a tsunami. There have been debates about exactly what it was. Was it the actual explosion, you know, the displacement of the flank of the volcano that created this kind of wave that propagated out from the volcano? There are many scientists who believe it was actually the blast. You know, this created a big blast. And I'll show you that in a moment. This is where it's located. It's along a subduction zone. And we not only have great earthquakes at subduction zones, we have the most active and destructive volcanoes in the world. And on our case, we've got Mount Baker, Mount Rainier, Mount Garibaldi. These are all very similar volcanoes to this one, except this one was on the seafloor when it blew its stack. And it borders the Tongan Trench. And there's a plate here that's moving down, Pacific plate is moving down beneath this portion of crust in the Australian plate. And plates can be either submerged beneath the sea, or they can be land areas. You don't normally have to think of plates as being either land or sea. This is the plate that is partially below the sea surface. And you've got this ring of volcanoes that basically lie along the backside of the subduction zone. And this was one, very active. It was known to be active, but nobody anticipated that it would produce the explosion that it did. And this was captured by satellite. So this is a satellite view of the eruption cloud coming up about 30 seconds or so after the volcano began to erupt. And all that ash is going to find its way up into tremendous altitudes in the atmosphere. But you can also see the kind of pressure wave that moved out in front of it. And there are many scientists who believe it was really the pressure wave that generated this far-traveled tsunami. And there, kind of in the academic community, there's talk of meteoro-tsunamis, or tsunamis that are produced by meteorological phenomena such as that. But anyway, that tsunami amazingly killed very few people. Tonga was really hit hard by it, but people had evacuated from shoreline areas, so it caused a lot of damage to the infrastructure, but only, I think, as far as I know, only 4 people were killed on Tonga by the tsunami itself. The tsunami reached South America. One person was killed in Peru, I believe, and it was measured along the California coast as reaching up to maybe a foot above normal sea level. So this was an ocean-wide event. And it did cause a lot of damage. This is a picture of a small town on Tonga that was pretty damaged by the tsunami itself. The other big one that you've heard about is the Krakatoa eruption in 1883. And this one was much more deadly because there were large numbers of people, even then, living along the shorelines in the Sunda Strait. And Krakatoa, as they say in Indonesia, was known to be an active volcano. This is the original shape of the volcano, this stippled area. In 1883, it basically exploded like the Tonga volcano did, and killed tens of thousands of people. They really don't know because there weren't very good population demographics back then. But it was a massive eruption. It actually affected Earth's climate for a couple of years. Large loss of life, probably the largest kind of historic eruption that we've experienced on the planet. And it's well documented by people at the time. This was a painting that was done, kind of crude, but you get the idea of the volcano exploding back in 1888, so about 5 years after the tsunami. And then this is a lithograph from a book that describes this steamship being deposited over a mile inland and 30 feet above sea level, killing the entire crew by that tsunami. So we knew it was a big one. And I really like this story because Edvard Munch painted this memorable painting called The Scream. And of course you focus on this woman who seems to be upset, but the sky, it was a ready sky. And that's thought to have been from the Krakatoa eruption. It basically put so much ash into the atmosphere that Northern Europe experienced these unbelievable sunsets for a year or two after the eruption. And so there's a theory that he was actually experienced this. This was 10 years after the event, but that he incorporated that in this painting. And it's not that the woman was terrorized by the earthquake and the tsunami. That's probably a sidebar story to it. It's just the atmosphere was colored red. And then the last event that I want to touch on is asteroid impacts. These are not very common, of course, certainly not on a scale that would produce a big tsunami, but there's something that some people worry about because moving around the Earth, there's a belt of asteroids outside the orbit of Mars and inside that of Saturn and the gaseous planets. And occasionally, although these tend to kind of be captured by the sun's gravitational field and be stable in their orbits around the solar system, every once in a while, one of them, for some reason, kicks in and circulates in a tighter path, around the sun. And occasionally we find one that actually will reach Earth. And of course, we see the moon's surface and we know that it's been impacted by these things. It's kind of a dead planet, so it just basically preserves the impact craters, whereas on Earth, they tend to get obliterated over geologic time by plate motions. But, some of these are quite large. This one kind of being tracked by NASA, probably Russia too. It's quite large, 6 kilometers, it's just a small part of it. And this one is the size of Oahu, Ida. So you wouldn't want to have one of those kind of impacting Earth, but it did happen, and it has happened, because even on our active planet, there are scores of impact craters from these asteroids that have struck the Earth. They typically are concentrated in areas where the crust or the Earth's surface is very old. In areas that are replenished by plate tectonics, you don't see many. That tells you that they're fairly rare, at least on the scale of producing craters that you can see on the planet's surface. A very famous one is in northern Arizona called Meteor Crater, and that's about 50,000 years old. And that's, was a pretty good impact. Wasn't anything like the impact that destroyed the dinosaurs, but it was a pretty big one. And so I played around with, well, I didn't actually. There are people who look at kind of frequency magnitude relationships and try and estimate what the average annual probability of impacts of asteroids of different size. So the size increases here. This probably is very close to the size of the asteroid that struck Earth in what is now Yucatan Peninsula 60 million years ago. But you can get, a 10-meter object striking the Earth's surface about every 50 years or so. And we're getting to be on a crowded planet. It seems like we're losing places where you're not going to have an impact like that. And it's equivalent to 20 kilotons, which means nothing to me. It's just a large number. And then as you scale up, these become really ridiculous. So these two here would be kind of life-threatening if they were ever to happen. But you can see that the probabilities are extremely low. So it's sort of unlikely. So do you worry about that? Not really, but some people do. And it's interesting that NASA is now playing around with deflecting the paths of these. So maybe if you can do it for a really big one, and you could eliminate the hazard before it actually materialized. So kind of all this. So I want to just touch on, well, what is the tsunami hazard in British Columbia? It's actually not very high, largely because these two, which are the big subduction zone sources, sort of sources on the opposite side of the ocean, Japan, Kamchatka, Alaska, are very far away. And this one is close, but both of these attenuate as they move up Juan de Fuca Strait and try and get through the southern Gulf Islands, so that places like Victoria are at a higher risk for those two types of events than Vancouver. And there's been modeling done that I'll just touch on briefly in closing that suggests that, you know, a big magnitude 8 or 9 earthquake every 500 years would produce a tsunami that's very destructive to places like Tofino and Ucluelet that are exposed, but not so much Vancouver. Probably the waves would attenuate to 1 to 2 meters by the time they enter the southern Strait of Georgia. So we're pretty lucky that way. These are frequent from different sources. You expect to get one every 20 years. We've had a couple of them. The Tohoku earthquake didn't cause any damage in British Columbia. So I wonder really how serious that is. However, there was a magnitude 9.3 earthquake in Alaska in 1964 that did cause a lot of damage to communities on the west coast of Vancouver Island. But anyway, those, you know, we have warning systems in place for these, what we call tele-tsunamis. They're distant source tsunamis. We would get very little warning for that type of event because source of the tsunami is so close to the coast. Particularly in the West Coast communities, you'd have 20 minutes from the time the earthquake occurs to seek higher ground. And that's the warning that we typically ask people to. If you feel shaking for 3 to 5 minutes, ground shaking of serious ground shaking for that length of time, you'd better get away from the shoreline as quickly as you possibly can. And then we can get, as I mentioned, we can get earthquakes on faults that are much closer to Vancouver that may extend across the southern Strait of Georgia, but these are very rare. We think that probably the return period, the average return on those is thousands of years. So we're not too worried about those. And then on unknowns, two unknowns are what I would call submarine landslides off the mouth of the Fraser Delta. Could that fail, produce a big landslide that would generate a tsunami? Some people think it could. I don't think it can, but that's a matter of debate. And we certainly don't know how likely an event like that is going to be. And then, as I mentioned, rock slides like the one in Lituya Bay, you know, our coastal inlets aren't terribly heavily populated. Norway worries about those way more than we do because they've experienced some fatalities from rock slides into their fjords. But I'm pretty certain that kind of in the short term, in the next few decades, we're going to see one of these events somewhere into a lake or into a fjord or into an inlet. But again, it's very hard to know from the limited data we have how likely an event like that is. So I went where angels fear to tread and produced this diagram that kind of shows my general overall view of tsunami hazards from all these sources on our coast. And we certainly can experience a big tsunami on the outer coast. The tsunami diminishes in size as it moves up Juan de Fuca Strait, irrespective of its source. And by the time the waves enter the Strait of Georgia, the northern Salish Sea, they're greatly diminished. So you wouldn't expect an awful lot of damage from a 1 to 2 meter high tsunami around Vancouver. So what can you do? This is my final piece. You know, how do we reduce the tsunami risk? Well, we have geophysical monitoring. We can monitor the buildup of stress along crustal faults, and we can know something about the likely mechanism of rupture along those faults and say something about the likelihood of, you know, an earthquake, a significant earthquake on any of those faults triggering a tsunami. So a huge amount of work's been done on the subduction zone fault, the mega fault, and we know that it produces big earthquakes and tsunamis on average about every 500 years, which is kind of typical for subduction zones. So that's kind of ongoing work, largely embedded within the federal government, but also increasingly in being done by university academics to kind of detect, to better understand what are the mechanisms that generate these tsunamis and how large they might be. We do geologic studies, we have a tsunami warning system. Education is important. You see tsunami warning signs in some communities. And then engineering is done in Japan to protect coastal infrastructure from the wave impacts. And I mentioned this, kind of taking the pulse of the Earth by measuring what's happening at the surface and kind of determining how that is expressed at the subduction, the megafaulted depth. And it relates to these satellite measurements that very precisely locate points. And now we're going on almost 3 decades of measurement. So we kind of know what's going on there. And it's kind of a continuous process. And so each passing year, we get a little closer to the next big subduction zone earthquake. Doesn't mean that it's going to happen 10 years from now, may happen 100 years from now, but we're getting closer. That's about all you can say. And then I'm a geologist, so I like to play around with detecting these events in the geologic record. And a good place to do that is in coastal marshes, because you can actually get a proxy for the downdropping of the Earth's crust. You can get a proxy for the tsunami in the form of these coarse layers of sand and gravel that extend into tidal marshes in coastal areas. So you see things like this at Tofino, where you have an old marsh surface that's covered by a layer of tsunami sand well to the east of the community. So that alone told me that that community can be seriously impacted by one of these Cascadia mega tsunamis. And we now have tsunami warning systems in areas where these are possible. So there's one in the North Pacific that can pick up the passage of these waves with pressure sensors that are on the seafloor that actually pick up that and then kind of report it back to satellites to the tsunami warning systems in Alaska and in Hawaii. However, they're rapidly being supplanted by actually tracking of tsunamis by satellites. So not only can we detect with precision the surface of the Earth, but we can detect the level of the ocean itself. So even small 10 to 20 centimeter rises as a tsunami goes past can be easily tracked by satellites. And this was an example back in 2004 where a satellite actually tracked the tsunami in the Indian Ocean from its source off Indonesia. And it's better than kind of the tsunami measurements on the seafloor because they're very limited and they tend to fail all the time. This is something that's reliable because it can map out the sea surface in full detail, not just at particular points. And I mentioned tsunami modeling. We have excellent tsunami modeling done at the Institute of Ocean Sciences in Victoria, in Sydney, BC. And this was a typical model that they would generate. They assume a rupture, then the displacement wave moving inland in this case, and reaching at different times, different portions of the coast. So after 43 minutes, it's basically reached the west coast of Vancouver Island and is propagating up Juan de Fuca Strait. 87 minutes, it's at Victoria. So Victoria has 87 minutes after a big earthquake to put in motion a response for a wave that still could be significantly high. And then it kind of breaks up as it moves into the Strait of Georgia. And you can see that low kind of white to pale pink is basically waves that are only a meter high or so. And interestingly, that happens 3 hours after the earthquake. So you basically can have a couple of coffees at Starbucks and then go home. And finally, education is very important. We see these tsunami warning signs everywhere. And engineering too. There are people who actually, particularly in Japan, are trying to design structures that will withstand tsunami wave impacts. And Japan's definitely a leader in all of that because they're more aware of the risk to their population than any other country in the world. And with that, I'll finish. Thanks very much. Ooh.
All right, thanks, John.
Sure.
Anybody have any questions? Colin?
I noted that you said you didn't fear the failure of the Fraser Delta grading, but also in one earlier slide you showed that when the slip happens,
Yeah.
There's a subsidence on the east coast of Vancouver Island. But also you showed one example of where the earthquake caused a slide. So it would a mega thrust
definitely
cause one inland.
It's open to question, really. The Fraser Delta slope is pretty steep at the, just below the intertidal flats. It's actually quite steep, and then it flattens out to less than a degree in deeper water. And so what you need to do to kind of determine how likely that is to fail if you shake it is to do engineering modeling, physical modeling, knowing something about the character of the materials that typically are silts and sands, and they're water saturated. So in theory, they can fail for sure. We did have a failure off the Delta front near Sandheads, which is off the main channel back about 30 years ago. It was quite large, but it didn't produce a tsunami. It was kind of a skin failure, more a shallow failure that kind of went down the slope and out into deep water. And so it didn't produce a tsunami, and yet, in my view, is kind of the largest failure you might expect on decadal timescales. But I wouldn't say it's impossible to get a much larger one. That happened in the Alaska earthquake. There were large failures on delta fronts in Southeast Alaska. And some of those failures, in fact, did propagate tsunamis that were independent of the big earthquake triggered tsunami. So some of the communities, I can't remember which ones now, Valdez, I think, for example, were serious. There was loss of life due to the failures at delta fronts. And independent of the earthquake, there was a failure at Skagway, at the head of a big inlet that seriously damaged a cruise ship terminal. I think it killed one worker, but it was a failure at the delta front, like you're just talking about, that actually caused damage. And then there was one in Kitimat in 1975 that produced a 9-meter wave off the front of the Kitimat Delta. So it's possible.
I want to ask if anyone, when we're done here, if anyone on Zoom has a question as well.
Yeah. Okay, I have a couple questions. The first one, I guess, is about the Salish Sea.
Yeah.
So you, in one of your diagrams, showed Vancouver Island as being kind of the leading edge, being pushed up, and the Juan de Fuca plate pushing it up.
Yeah.
So if the slippage is, the leading edge of that slippage is Vancouver Island, and you're talking about a wave coming into Georgia Strait and into the Salish Sea, but wouldn't the Salish Sea be affected by the island pushing ahead and the slippage?
That's a very good comment. And that's why particularly the geophysicists are better trying to model this interface that's locked. And the critical issue is how far east does that extend? Would you expect, say, eastern Vancouver Island to drop down during an earthquake? And current thinking is no. We don't see geologic evidence of that. The zone where you get down dropping is farther to the west, say out to Fino. So yes, there is that pressure that's being exerted at the leading front, but the leading front is probably west of Vancouver, west of the east coast of Vancouver Island.
Okay.
Having said that, this is an evolving story, and it's very important to know, how far down you might get rupture. Could it possibly be beneath eastern Vancouver Island? Then what you're talking about is reasonable.
Possibility.
Yeah.
The second question is, I've read about a very low tide in front of a tsunami. And you didn't mention that, but that's a huge issue. What would cause that, and when would it be caused? And would we have to worry about that?
It is an issue, and commonly in the case of Thailand, the front of the tsunami was a withdrawal of water. The water level fell to positions that nobody had ever seen before. Yeah, but it results in the fact, kind of what happens is the land behind the uplifted plate drops. So the seafloor drops, and that generates a trough before the leading high wave of the tsunami arrives. You think about it, yeah, you can't do it very well, but you know, it's a dipping plane, and what happens in the earthquake is the western side is elevated and the eastern side drops down relative to the side that's being pushed up. And so the first indication of the wave moving away from that rupture is a trough where the seafloor has dropped down. But it's very rapidly followed by, you know, a high wave. And so it depends upon kind of the rupture and whether you're on one side of the fault, like I would imagine in Sri Lanka, that didn't happen because it's west and the seafloor was displaced upwards. So the first indication of the tsunami would be a high wave.
When you want to take one of the questions from...
Oh, there aren't any.
Oh, they are?
You can ask anybody if they want to unmute if they have a question.
If there's anybody who's doing this online, if you want, yeah, we'll split up. Anybody who's online, if you want to unmute and ask a question, we have a few minutes left. Okay.
Hi. So you mentioned 250,000 people dying. Now, was that just from Thailand, or was it Thailand and Japan?
It was Thailand and Japan.
Okay.
I think there were, it's really hard to know these numbers, but the number that keeps getting posted is 16,000 in Japan, 16,000, and they're almost entirely from the tsunami. There was about 230,000 in the Indian Ocean countries. There's a large number of them where they had fatalities. And in Indonesia, that includes a lot of people who died from the ground motion too, from structural collapse, because it was right there, very close. So I'm it's about 250,000 in total, but some of those are kind of normal earthquake fatalities. Most of them were the tsunami though. It was.
All right. Thank you very much, John.
Sure, my pleasure.
Thank you, everyone who's attending in person or online. And don't forget, we have another one coming up on the 17th of November, I believe, about culture and anthropology and the importance of protecting our heritage buildings and such within Vancouver. And that's given by a UBC grad student, Jonathan Deaton, who's a member of DEEP for a little while before he leaves for Minnesota to join his wife. And I'd like to thank Christian for all his work in setting up the IT bit of all of this. And once again, thanks, John, for coming out and doing this for us.